Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome all of you. I'm Dr. Terry Winfrey, and I'm the president of the Chicago Southland Chamber of Commerce. And I'm very excited to tell you about a few things that we have going on at the Chicago Southland Chamber of Commerce. Those of you who are members probably know a lot of this because you get emails from us on a regular basis. Some of you are guests and don't get those updates. But I'd like to tell you that we haven't stopped with or without COVID. We've continued to go on. We continue to have regular events, regularly scheduled events. We just had a fabulous golf outing and it was wonderful. So that was in person. That was really nice to see that. We just came off of a week having 4 in-person events also as part of our membership drive. So we are in fact recruiting new members during the month of October, and there's lots of benefits to join during the month of October. So if anybody's interested, they could see me or Sherry Hensley and we could fill you in about those. We do have one more of those face-to-face events that's going to be next Wednesday, the 20th. From 3 to 6 p.m. at Bank Financial in Olympia Fields. Our board chairman, Connie Sims, is hosting that event there at the bank where she is employed. So that's a little bit about the membership drive. And there's, again, lots of benefits to joining during this month of October. The other things that we also have going on tomorrow, we have a virtual event at noon, and that one is sponsored by our healthcare committee, and it'll be very exciting for anyone that would like to attend. It's a serious matter, serious concept, conversation about the world we're living in, the mental health that's surrounding us, that we're all stressing with what's going on around us. But we also have, in addition to that, a nice way of giving you some tools so that people have tools to deal with things for the mental health. And so ending with a happy note from Franciscan Hospital about a 30-day program that they have. So that'll be nice. The other thing that we also have coming up is also a lunch and learn on how to Google your business and this back to business. We've been working hard with this back to business grant and helping navigate people through that. That is at noon virtual.
Chicago Southland Chamber.
And so then we also have on November 4th, a meet and greet where people will be able to meet all of the new members.
Yes, it's on right now.
Okay, shoot. Okay, so at this point, the one
I'm sorry, I'm in the middle of running this webinar. I could did you sign up for it? I mean, they're on.
Excuse me, Sherry, could you mute, please? Okay, so the one group that I've not yet spoken about that we have, I mean, we have several other groups, but one is the Government Affairs Committee. And the Government Affairs Committee is the group that sponsors this event that we're hosting right now. And so Mayor Ron Gardiner, who's the mayor in Glenwood, is one of the members of that committee, and he is our facilitator today. So I'm going to turn this over to him, and he's going to introduce our keynote speaker, the tax assessor, Fritz Kaegi, and also Scott Smith from his office. So Mayor Gardiner, please take it away.
We're honored to have our assessor Fritz Kaegi here this morning. It should be a lively chat. I'll read a quick bio as we're waiting for the assessor to come on. Regarding Assessor Fritz Kaegi, prior to the beginning of his career in Cook County government, Fritz spent more than 20 years valuing assets as a mutual fund portfolio manager and analyst. In his 13 years at Columbia Wagner Asset Management, Fritz served as a financial steward, helping average families save for retirement and focusing on small companies operating around the world. He holds the Chartered Financial Analyst and Certified Illinois Assessment Officer designations. He is also a member of the IAAO, the International Association of Assessing Officers. Since assuming office in 2018, Fritz has brought fairness, ethics, and transparency to the Cook County Assessor's Office with a vision focused on operational changes, technological upgrades, and the elimination of favoritism. The changes have increased predictability in the assessment system and spurred investment in Chicago and Cook County. Fritz was born and raised in the Hyde Park neighborhood in Chicago and still maintains close ties to the community. He attended Hyde Park's Kenwood Academy for high school, completed his undergraduate studies at Haverford College, and received his MBA from Stanford University. In 2020, Fritz received the A. Philip Randolph Change Agent Award from the National A. Philip Randolph Pullman Porter Museum, and in 2021, the Adlai Stevenson Award for Public Service from the Chicago chapter of the American Society for Public Administration. Fritz's wife, Rebecca, is a teacher. They live in Oak Park with their 3 children, where Fritz is a member of the First United Methodist Church of Oak Park. Assessor Kaegi, I know we welcome you. Thank you very much. I know your time is valuable, so thank you for taking your time today.
Mr. Mayor, it's my pleasure, Ron, and thanks everyone, Sherry and Terry, for making this possible today. We really appreciate the opportunity. We really appreciate everyone out there being with us today. We're all persevering and overcoming a lot, including all of the things that prevent us from being together. But you know what? We're going to roll with it, just like you guys do in your business and in your work as government administrators. And just want to commend everyone for persevering. And next time we'll be meeting in person. I look forward to seeing everyone there. So in this extraordinary time, let's take advantage of the benefits of Zoom. We'll be able to give you some graphics. We'll be able to take your questions over chat. And then we're going to leave plenty of time for conversation, because that's always the best part. So we have some good information for you here. Some of you might have seen a little bit of this before, some of you not, but the thing I wanted to remind you about, and as I've mentioned before, when I came into this office, one of the very first things I realized is that even folks who are steeped in business, steeped in the real estate industry, people who are making tax policy as policymakers or elected officials, even these people have a not perfect understanding of how our property tax assessment system works. So how can the average citizen expect to have a grasp on it? So there's a lot of complexities. I just want to focus in on some key takeaways that you can get from today's event. The first thing to remember is that we do not, at the assessor's office, we do not raising revenue. Assessments are not about the raising of revenue. Your taxing bodies, which are your school boards and your villages, they determine the total amount of tax that has to be raised in your community, which is why the position of tax assessor is only a position that exists in the Blues Brothers. In fact, the Cook County Assessor and the other assessment bodies, we don't raise revenue. We basically are determining everyone's share of the burden that's already been determined by school boards and municipalities and other folks that drive those things that are called levies in your community. So think about school boards and other taxing bodies as determining the burden. And then assessments are how we divide up the burden amongst all the different property owners in that community. So it's about share of burden. Assessments are, that's why we do assessments. We don't do assessments to raise revenue. We do assessments so that we're dividing up that burden that's already been determined amongst us. So that's the first thing to remember. And what's the standard for doing that? That's the first key takeaway, which is that the standard that the state has set in the property tax code is market value for assets, or how we determine assessments. So the market value for 1.9 million parcels across Cook is all that we focus on at the office, besides exemptions. Really the job that our valuations department is focusing on is measuring, taking a snapshot in time of where the market is for different kinds of assets. We have incredible a variety of commercial and industrial assets across our wonderful county. It ranges from warehouses and office buildings and hotels to steel plants and chemical works, bowling alleys and car washes. They're all very, very different, and they go to their own drummer. And then we have all the different kinds of homes that we have under the sun, not to mention condos and 2 and 6 flats and big apartment buildings. So that's a lot of different kinds of buildings. We're actually the largest market-based jurisdiction in America. And the value that we come up with is based on the data that we have that goes into our models. So we're about 230 people trying to estimate the value of these nearly 2 million properties, which are all very different. How we do that is done based on mass appraisal, which is taking inputs and transactions. So the inputs are characteristics about a building, and then also looking at transactions that have taken place and taking a look at other value drivers that are out there in the market to try to estimate the value of all these different things. We're not doing it, generally, we're not going to do this property by property. We're going to do it across like groups of properties so that's uniformly done and consistent. And this also ensures fairness under the Illinois Constitution. We have an obligation to make sure that like buildings and like situations are assessed in the like way. And so we try to do that. We also administer exemptions. I don't think that's as important for the conversation today. Think of us as the ones that we're trying to estimate where markets are, what the value of buildings are, so that we can determine the share of the burden that's cooked up by the taxing bodies. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So this is just a longer way of saying what I just told you. So over on the left, those are the levies. That's the taxes. That's the burden that's cooked up by our taxing districts, mainly schools. Schools represent about 2/3 of property taxes. In some South suburban communities, it's up to 70% or more. So that's the levy side of the equation over on the left. Over on the right is assessments, and that's dividing up the share of the burden. And the key thing to remember is that your assessment does not exist in isolation. Your assessment is helping to determine your share of the burden. And so it's not only your assessment that matters to you, but how other people are assessed very much matters to you, because how they're assessed determines your share of that overall burden. So if we as the assessor here, we're doing a good job when we're estimating the market value fairly for all different kinds of assets. There's a second piece to the assessment process, the Cook County Board of Review. Once we're done taking appeals, they are another layer of appeals, and that can also alter the tax base in different communities. So that's something important to bear in mind. Then once the board review is done, they hand their assessed values back to us. We apply, we get the equalization factor from the Illinois Department of Revenue. Don't worry about the equalization factor too much unless you're in a jurisdiction that overlaps with another county, then that can affect you a little bit. I would not be distracted by equalized assessed values because they are really not going to have much of an impact on your share of burden. The Cook County Clerk determines the tax rate, which is a function of the levies divided by the total equalized assessed value in your community. That's where the rate comes from, and then it's applied to your assessed value. And then the treasurer sends out the bills and collects the taxes. And the treasurer also is responsible for things you might have heard about, like the scavenger sale and so on. So again, the assessor's office doesn't collect the taxes, doesn't determine the taxes. We're just, our estimates of market value end up determining your share of the burden. Okay. Just a reminder that as we're looking at the county, we're reassessing 1/3 of it each year. So this year in 2021, we're reassessing Chicago, which is actually a little bit over half of the parcels in the county. 2019, we did the north, and last year we reassessed the south and west suburbs. So that was that, and that would have been reflected in your tax bills just paid on October 1st. So This is a good reminder. You know, we had some questions in the lead up to the event today. Why are tax rates so high in the south suburbs? And I wish, you know, I could take a magic wand with assessments to put it more on a more equal footing with the rest of the county, which has a lower rate. Unfortunately, the rate that is paid in the south suburbs is not structurally determined by assessments themselves. It's determined by the fact that you have to collect levies in your communities to pay for the schools and municipal services that you need, and market values are lower in the south suburbs. So you're dividing a levy across a lower base of market values, and that results in lower assessed values, and that structurally results in higher rates. Now, what do we do about that? We can talk about that. Basically, the greatest injustice, the reason why the south suburbs start out with a big rate, a higher rate automatically, is that our state does less than any other state to help foot the cost of educating children. Our school districts are more on their own for taxing property to raise the revenues for educating our children than any other place in the nation. And if we look at the state of Illinois, there's no greater area where that burden falls heavily than the Southland. So we need to remind people in the state and federally that the Southland uniquely suffers from this unfairness, which is, I think, the original inequity that starts even before we get into assessments, which is this funding inequality for schools. And we can talk more about that. But I know a lot of you ask, why are the rates so high? And if we had a magic wand at the assessor's office to change that, we could, but we can't. It's really, even if you and I and everyone else could all agree on the assessments, the assessed value in your communities, the rate would structurally be multiples of where it is in Chicago and the rest of the county, simply because market values for properties are lower in the Southland, and that levy is spread across a very narrow base of market values. And that is really a foundational unfairness that our state and our federal government can address by getting more funding into our schools and putting less burden onto your shoulders. So we talked about this again, levy and base. These are two different concepts. The key that we're trying to do at the assessor's office is make sure that that base fully reflects what's going on in the market for all the different kinds of properties: commercial, big, commercial, small, industrial, and residential of all shapes and sizes. I wanted to show you an example of the kinds of data that we look at in coming up with values for commercial properties in your community. We chose Rich Township just because when I've been down to see you guys, we've often focused on there. We've met down there, so I just chose Rich Township. I'm not playing favorites amongst all the Southland, but this was, I thought, a pretty good representative one. I wanted to show you there's data on our website where you can see Thornton, Bloom, Bremen, Worth, all the other Southland townships, and you can see the kinds of assumptions that we make in valuing those properties. Why do we make these assumptions? Because the properties, unless they tell us, we don't have reported to us what the rental range, rental income, or occupancy or expense ratio is. So if they're not reported to us, we have to use commercial sources to try to estimate what those value drivers are. When you're valuing something like an apartment building, there are several different value drivers that drive them in the market. If any of you guys own apartment buildings, you know this. You can see how we came up with the value of apartment buildings in Rich Township. So first of all, we sort them into quality tiers because they're kind of different investment communities for each quality tier. In the institutional, these are the highest end kinds of properties that would typically be owned by a national or international investor. They're typically worth tens of millions of dollars. You can see we're assuming a rent range of around $900 to $1,000 for those kind of per month for those kinds of apartment buildings. We assumed a 5% vacancy rate. We can talk about occupancy conditions in apartments down in the south suburbs. We assume an expense ratio of 40 to 45%. You can see the cap rate. What is a cap rate? The cap rate is how you convert a cash flow into a price for the building in the market. So if a building's earning 10%, $10 million in a year, and we're using a 5% cap rate for it, it would be worth 200 million. These cap rates are pretty representative. They're actually pretty conservative estimates of where they are in the market. We're seeing lots of cap rates trading in the low fives in many different places, or even in the fours. When we did our COVID, when we took into account the effect of COVID, we saw additionally that there was impact, especially at the bottom end of apartments, because there was difficulty with rent collection. People were having to make adjustments to the rent levels to keep people in place. So we did adjust the cap rates that we used because of COVID. And you can see what this all translated into in terms of value per unit. So at the higher end, in the institutional class, we're valuing apartment buildings somewhere between 100,000 to 120,000 per unit. But then as you get lower down on the quality scale, you can see they go as low as $37,000 per unit in these other areas. And we have the lower value per unit in some places, basically because a higher cap rate and higher expenses and lower rent. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So that's apartments. What about offices? You can see that in the suburbs, we typically do not have the top tier office properties in the south suburbs. So there are very few institutional office buildings down in the south suburbs. Mostly these are B and C office spaces, and you can see the assumptions we made there in terms of rent per square foot, vacancy rate, expense ratio, the cap rate. You can see the cap rate is quite high for these, 9% plus. And then we added additional amount onto the cap rate because of COVID. As we know, office was very much affected by COVID, and you can see what that translated into in the dollar per building. So, we see office buildings, in a range of sort of typically single-digit millions of dollars. The top end office property in Rich Township was $12 million. Here you can see the kinds of assumptions that we'd use for other kinds of commercial properties. Note that for these different kinds of commercial properties, we'll use different assumptions for the different kinds of businesses we're looking at. So shopping centers are a little different from strip malls, or different from big box stores, or different from car washes. But you can see in general, the kinds of cap rates that we used, so anywhere from 7 to 12%, based on including the effect of COVID. So COVID adjustments of up to 150 basis points were added on to the cap rate because of the effect of COVID on certain kinds of retail properties. And you can see what translated in the value per building. Again, we didn't see any institutional level commercial retail properties in Rich. We saw about 88 regional level properties. The top value one was at about 25 million. But you can see there's quite a range depending on if it's a strip mall or a small one-off store. And there was quite a range of outcomes here under COVID. Supermarket type properties were doing really well. Other kinds of commercial properties were suffering more. So that was a wide range of experience across different kinds of properties. Industrial is probably one of the hottest asset classes, and last year during COVID, we did see some impact on industrial properties, but mostly, there was at the top end, industrial properties were actually doing pretty well. Down at the C level, we did add a little bit of to the cap rate because even C level warehouses were hurt a little bit by the effect of COVID. Not having people to work in some of the industrial and warehouse buildings. So you can see the cap rate was 10% at the bottom range, 7% for the highest tier asset. You can see the value per square foot for those different kinds of properties. And this is a market where it's really important to know the quality tier. So we'll talk more about the data that we put into our assessments and how important that is to get your assessments right. So that we're assessing you accurately, properly, and that you don't have to undertake the cost of appeal if you don't have to. If we know that you have a C quality warehouse, it's better to start out your assessment there, and then you can use all of the appeal rights that you have, rather than us starting you out at a B or A, and then that can just add to your costs in the appeals process. We'd like to get the number right at the outset so we could save you money and get our assessments more accurate. I wanted to show you how the overall reassessment shook out in the South Suburbs. So one of the things I want to point out is that both residential and commercial value was both increased in the South Suburbs last year. So we saw residential value rising from 8.8 billion to 8.1 billion on an assessed value basis in the overall South and West Suburbs. You can see that commercial rose from 3.4 to 4.9. So this Cook County Assessor's Office is that sort of kink in the middle of the chart there. That was what we saw in our stage of the reassessment. The reason why you saw commercial rising so much is a continuation of the trend that we've seen in other places that we've reassessed, that the previous administration, a lot of its assessments didn't seem to match what was going on in the market. We saw, especially with, I think, apartment buildings, some things like self-storage, that they were estimating values that didn't seem to have much relationship to where the market actually was. And small business and homeowners were shouldering that additional burden because of substandard valuations done by our office and the board review collectively. So what we did is we realigned assessed values on commercial last year. Through the appeals process of the board review, you can see at the second stage that there was small amount of reduction in residential, but there was a much greater reduction in commercial. So about $11 of assessed value reduced for every dollar of residential at the board review. And so that resulted in a tax base in the end where it was about $8 billion of assessed value for residential and 3.7 billion for commercial and industrial. You can see how this shook out in terms of, oh, here's the county. So you can see the same result on the county-wide basis, and you can see how the share of burden changed. So at the assessor's office stage of the reassessment, homeowners' share of the burden fell from 59 to 55%. But because the board review cut, commercial assessments were by about $11 for every dollar that they cut residential. About 3 percentage points went back on to homeowners through the assessment cycle. So in the end, county residential taxpayers had 1 percentage point less of the overall burden in the county at the end of the assessment cycle last year. Oh, here's the South Sub. Oh, so we saw the South Suburbs. I wanted to show you, we have a tool that we have up on the site so you can see what the tax base looked like in your municipality. If we go to the next slide, this is something that I think you'll find very useful and illuminating. You can go and look in every single municipality in Cook County and see what happened to the tax base last year in the reassessment. And you can oftentimes, this tells a story for why tax bills might have fallen or risen in your community. It also helps you to understand the tax base of a place that you're looking at. You can also see what are some of the biggest movers in the tax base through the appeals process. So the way you do this is you go to our website, cookcountyassessor.com. Then you click on the new data dashboard, which will sort of be at the bottom left when you go to our website. And then that will take you to a township level dashboard. And then you can click where it says municipal tax base, and that will take you to the municipal dashboard. And then you can look in every single municipality. And it's an interesting thing to compare what happened to the tax base in every municipal community. I think all of you who operate in different parts of the Southland, I see lots of members of municipalities here today. I think it's really illuminating to look at it, to understand what's happening with your base, because you as municipalities, you can also intervene before the board review on behalf of protecting your base. If there are some commercial properties that are appealing their assessed value and you think that that's not merited, you can intervene by working with your local school district to protect your tax base and keep rates down for all your taxpayers. And one thing that I wanted to let you know that I also thought would be a good update since we last met is we talked with you about taking a second look at how the assessor's office and our assessment system treats vacancy. We heard from you, we heard from other regional chambers of commerce, really all over the county, from every different kind of community, that it was perceived that the assessor's office under the previous administration really was almost incentivizing vacancy. That if a property was 100% vacant, that its assessment could be reduced by up to 90%. And as you guys know, for those of you who are active in real estate markets, if you keep a property vacant, its value in the market does not fall 90%. It would fall by some fraction of that. And so what we did is we looked at the policies that are in place in other counties in Illinois. We looked at best practices in other jurisdictions, what the International Association of Assessing Officers recommends. We came out with a new policy last year. It came out last May of 2020. And it says that every commercial property in a corridor will get credit for the neighborhood vacancy rate, whether the property is fully occupied or not. And the reason why is that a prudent buyer, even if it's looking at a fully occupied property, could not assume that will always be fully occupied. So they will assume a prudent vacancy rate in their own valuation of that property. And we do that too. So if we're looking at a commercial corridor where we estimate there's 25% vacancy for retail properties, we will assume that vacancy rate in the valuation of all retail properties on that corridor. Now, if a commercial property owner comes to us and says that, well, my property is actually 50% vacant, I should get relief for the vacancy that I have. What we'll say is that, okay, so you're claiming 25% additional vacancy over and above what is already baked into people's valuation. We will give you credit for 50% of that additional amount on a temporary basis. So for just a couple of years. So then that property would get an additional 12.5% additional vacancy relief. You can look at the calculations that we use on the site. And the reason why is that if a investor, and we always have to put ourselves in the shoes of an investor, a typical buyer, if they were looking at a property that had that amount of vacancy, they could assume that they could reasonably over time achieve the local neighborhood occupancy rate for that kind of property in their projections. And that is basically what the policy that we've put in place also assumes. And that vacancy treatment is temporary. How does this help other property owners? First of all, it is not penalizing people who have their property that's occupied, because the way our policy worked before is that if your property was 100% occupied, our valuation assumed it was always 100% occupied in the value that you could get for it in the market, which is not the case. And in the assessed value base, if we were giving huge reductions for people who had property that was vacant, the properties that were staying open were shouldering too much of the burden over and above what they would be merited based on market values. Second of all, this is good in terms of public policy, because vacancy hurts. When you have vacant properties on a commercial corridor, it hurts the properties next door that are fully occupied. They don't get the same footfall or same traffic. And it also hurts vitality in the neighborhood. It hurts sales tax revenues, which can take some of the burden off of property taxes. And of course, it provides employment. So for a bunch of reasons, revising the policy was long overdue, and we're glad we did it. The other thing I wanted to mention is that for this policy to work well, we need to have a good estimate of what the local vacancy rate is. One of the ways we can do that is to have you submit real property income and expense forms. So starting last year, when we did the reassessment in the South Suburbs, every commercial parcel owner received an RPI form and login ID. And we should, and folks who participated are glad that they did, because especially in the Southland, where you have above average expenses and you have above average costs for things like security or lost rent collection, or other things that are detractors to value. Sometimes those detractors are not reflected in the data that we subscribe to. So filing that RPI form was something that saved people money. As we're reassessing Chicago right now, we see that some of the most sophisticated retail investors in the world submitting RPI forms, and they're glad that they did, because they can show how damaging COVID has been to their operating income, and we can take that into account. It saves them, and it will save you lots of costs on the appeals process, because most fees for appeals that a lawyer or a service provider might charge you are sort of, the jumping off point is that initial assessment that we send out. So if you get us an RPI with that information before we've sent out the assessment, it can lower the legal costs of the appeals process. We could get your assessment right from the get-go, and it saves you a lot of time and trouble. And a lot of uncertainty. So we are seeing rising participation rates in the RPI. You have to fill it out when you appeal anyway, so why not do it initially so you can lower your costs from the outset? That's a pitch that we wanted to make, and this RPI helps us to estimate neighborhood vacancy rates well on a corridor. So the more people are participating on a corridor, the more well-established we can get that neighborhood vacancy rate, and all the properties that are open benefit from getting credit for the vacancy rate on the corridor. So this sort of leads to the second way that we can try to gather better vacancy rate information. I've talked to you before about the data modernization bill, which is really the key to building a modern data collection system like our peers have in the rest of the country. And the data collection system just gives us an accurate picture of where costs and rents and occupancy is in every commercial corridor. And it's really valuable. It will be really valuable to commercial operators and communities in the South Suburbs, especially because you oftentimes have higher costs, lower rents. You have to make more accommodations and incentives to get people into the space, tenant improvements and things like that. If we know about that, which would be reported in the data modernization bill framework on an anonymous basis, that could be baked into our valuations from the start. If we know that, if we have an accurate picture of vacancy rates on a corridor, that allows us to give credit to all the businesses that are there, whether they're operating or not, credit for that. And that, again, lowers initial costs and helps to get our assessment system on a better footing right from the start. It also helps economic development staff in different municipalities to have this more granular picture of what's going on in your real estate market and the real estate markets around you. The sponsor of the bill in the House is Will Davis, who many of you know. And in the Senate, it's Christina Castro on the Revenue Committee, who represents the Northwest suburbs. I think from there, we can just go to questions, because I know we've got a great group here today. Why don't we just go into Q&A? Those are just some things that I wanted to give you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Assessor. We really appreciate it. We do have several questions. I'll bring up one here. In Indiana, there's a state law that caps local residential property taxes 2% of the home's market value. So a home that would sell for $200,000 on the open market would be taxed no more than $4,000 a year. Thus, when a home goes down in value, the taxes go down and vice versa. That seems to be the opposite in Illinois. In such cities as Harvey, say, as a home values decline, property taxes increase to compensate for the lost valuation. It can become almost a death spiral. What are your thoughts about property tax caps that's based on a percentage of the home's fair market value?
The structure that Indiana has works because they have county income taxes in Indiana. County income taxes help to pay for the education of their children there. And so they don't have to lean so heavily on property taxes. It's not a life or death issue to them if property taxes go down in an individual year, if you have a housing crisis, for example. The South Suburbs couldn't do that because we don't have county income taxes here in Illinois. And our school districts, to fund themselves, totally depend on property taxes. They get about 25% of their funding from the state, maybe another 10% funding from the federal government. Everything else depends on property taxes. And if we have a housing crisis like happened in 2008, where home values in places like Harvey fell 50%, government couldn't fund itself. You couldn't pay for the kids' education. So how do we get out of this? The key is to figure out a way to finance schools without having to put it on the shoulders of people who own brick and mortar. This is becoming more urgent with COVID, right? And digitalization of the economy. More and more of the economy is flowing through digital channels, and we have less and less need for brick and mortar. Think about this meeting we're doing right here. We might do it at a hotel ballroom a couple of years ago. Who's taxing Zoom, right? What does Zoom do to help pay for the education of children in Harvey? Nothing. And so figuring out a way so that we can get more at the margin funding for schools is the way we get the property tax bills down in a real way. And so we should all, as folks who care about, bricks and mortar is what makes places interesting. What you do, what members of your community do is what makes places special. Think of all the unique businesses in your community. Why should the whole digital part of the economy get a pass on funding important things that are important for us as a society, like educating our children, rather than it all fall on the shoulders of people who own brick and mortar? So that's why I'd take that question from Indiana, because in Indiana, the way they solve this is they have a county income tax that helps to shoulder the cost of educating their kids. And the county income tax does capture more of that digital activity.
Thank you for that answer. I have another question here. Every county in the state except for Cook County assesses all their properties at 33.33% of its market value. As the state equalization factor is generally around 1.0% for these counties, taxpayers in these counties pay tax on 33.33% of their market value. In Cook County, residents are assessed at 10% of their market value and businesses are assessed at 25% of their market value. Since the state equalization factor for Cook County is around 3.0%, Cook County businesses pay taxes on 75% of their market value, which is much higher than the 33.33% paid in other counties. Do you think Cook County's multiple tiered system for applying different assessed valuations to different classes of properties need to be changed to a level to level the field between Cook County businesses and businesses in other counties? And the second part of that, does the practice of subsidizing Cook County residents at the expense of Cook County businesses need to be reformed?
I consider that question sort of that they're both linked there. You know, having a two-tier classification rate, which is what we do, is not uncommon in the rest of America. If you look in our peer urban jurisdictions in New York and Boston and Minneapolis, and look at Indiana, by their state constitution, commercial is at 3 times the level of residential under their constitution. So you can have a healthy economic environment while still having differential classification rates. It's not the multiplier, by the way, that does that. It's the classification rate where commercial is 25% and residential is 10%. Again, I think a more productive strategy for folks who want to reform our system is to reform the levies, which make our rates high, because then you reduce the burdens on everyone. If we tinker around with classification rates, you just put more burden on others. So let's say we moved, commercial to an equal footing with residential, that would just put more burden on homeowners in your communities. And I don't think that would solve much, and it would just cause more pain. The smarter thing to do is to lower the amount of funding that your schools have to get by taxing brick and mortar. That is the way we can really move the burdens in a direction. And the sooner that happens, it will be like, the moment that happens, it'll be like a jolt of adrenaline in real estate markets in the Southland. Like, just the federal government doubling its Title I support for schools, which is in the federal budget, by the way, this year, will be like a jolt of adrenaline for those South suburban school districts that drive your property tax bills.
Thank you. We have another question from Christy DeLaurentis, the South Suburban Mayors and Managers Association Executive Director.
Hello, Christy.
CCAO applied the COVID factor to properties in 2020, but you appear not to be applying a similar COVID adjustment to Chicago parcels for Chicago Triad reassessment this year. Will the COVID adjustment be eliminated from South Suburban tax bills for 2021 and 2022 tax years? Will the removal cause a rebound in value and trigger a sizable increase in individual property tax bills?
The reason why we took into account COVID when we reassessed the South Suburbs last year is so that we didn't send out inflated, out-of-date assessments on commercial properties in the Southland. Imagine if we didn't do a COVID adjustment last year for the Southland. That would mean that a hotel owner, a retail owner, an office owner would have gotten an assessment that was way out of date, way inflated. And that would have been in place until 2023. And we thought that was extremely unfair given all of the hardship that the Southland faced to begin with. So that's why we took on the challenge of COVID, including that in our assessments last year, so that rather than putting all that cost and burden on the South Suburbs for 3 years, and they can appeal it through the appeals process to take into account the effect of COVID, but that is just adding an unnecessary cost onto commercial property owners. So that's why we took that into account last year. Well, we're reassessing Chicago this year as of January 1st. And of course, that includes the effect of COVID. So COVID, if you look at the way we assessed office buildings and hotels and retail properties like on the Mag Mile, you'll see that includes the effect of COVID quite significantly, as everything does, because we did it as of January 1st. So we reassess the county 1/3 at a time. We'll reassess the north suburbs next year, and then the south suburbs the following year.
So as far as another question here, it's on the same grain as the last question. So there's no time, the COVID-19 adjustment, is it temporary, or when the value be reinstated in the south suburbs? Because obviously the COVID adjustment has had a greater impact on the COVID adjustment already had a on the low greater effect on the low valued homes, leading to more homeowners having zero tax bill. So I guess the main question is there a time frame as far as lifting the COVID-19, or is it play it by ear?
We're 2023.
Okay. We have another question here. There are a lot of exemptions that are passed by the state legislature for veterans, seniors, any number of different exemptions. What are your thoughts as far as limits on these exemptions? They're not means tested, and obviously with the exemptions, which is quite a few different exemptions, which are passed on to the taxpayers, is there any thoughts for you to propose something as far as means testing?
So in terms of exemptions, I think when Springfield is considering changing exemptions, especially the exemption levels, like the dollar amount of exemptions, their first call should be to you. Their first call should be to the Southland, because oftentimes when Springfield is making adjustments to exemptions, they are not thinking of the unintended consequences. And I know from talking to Chrissy DeLaurentis and other folks here on the call, when they did this back in 2017 and they changed the exemption amounts, it had unintended consequences of throwing lots of homes off the rolls in places like Park Forest. I think 10% of the homes went off the rolls, pushing more of the burden onto the remainder men and women who are working. And that was not fair. And I don't think the folks in Springfield even thought of that. So and there was a little bit of an effort in Springfield this year to consider raising the exemption amount. So all of us here need to really be in the ears of leadership down in Springfield, of the revenue committees, and the leadership overall in the two chambers of the General Assembly, to say, hey guys, we feel the consequences when you change exemption amounts, and that you have to very closely study any change that you're thinking about making, and think about the impact on us, where we've suffered from the unfairness of this property tax system all along, because you're underfunding our schools. Don't hurt us again by making us the victims of a policy where you haven't considered the impact on us. Means testing is complicated because the Illinois Department of Revenue does not give us instant or automatic access to people's incomes. We would like the Illinois Department of Revenue to share, just tell us, for example, on the senior exemption, senior freeze, it's $65,000 adjusted household income. All we want to know is from IDOR is, does a household qualify for this or not? We don't need to know the actual amount of income. And it is very burdensome on us if we're playing H&R Block on hundreds of thousands of applicants to try and do this ourselves, and basically have people work on the honor code when they report that to us. So we think that the best way to address means tested exemptions that are already there is for IDOR to do more data sharing with us and other assessors, so that we can have better, cleaner enforcement where we close that loop very easily. Ditto, we could do the same thing with the federal government. The federal government actually shares income information with municipalities that have an income tax. There's really no reason why they couldn't do that with municipalities that have a means tested exemption, or states that have means tested exemptions. So we've talked to some members of Congress on working on that. All it would require is one sentence into the tax code. But exemptions exist, let's remember, to add a measure of progressivity to a really regressive system. And so that's why exemptions are important. And we support their existence. We especially support exemptions such as the disabled veterans exemption, which is reflecting the values of the people of our state and paying tribute to people who paid ultimate sacrifice of life and limb and health with a measure of relief that really doesn't materially affect other people's property tax bills.
I have a question here from Trustee Hadnot from the Village of Glenwood, right here in the beautiful town of Glenwood. What is being done about tax exemption cheating in Cook County?
So we've been doing an actual lot. So we hired a service provider called TrueRoll that allows us to scour credit ratings reports and many other different databases that can help us flag cheaters. So we have a pretty good line of sight on anyone who is claiming multiple homeowners exemptions or has multiple different residences across the United States. If someone's moved, there's several other things that can help flag suspicious exemption applications. And we've caught hundreds of cheaters so far and back-billed millions of dollars of property tax bills doing that. We really appreciate our municipal partners on this. One of the things that we're seeing more and more of is institutional ownership of single-family homes through real estate investment trusts and private equity. And those kinds of owners should not be claiming homeowners exemptions unless they have in their lease a special agreement with the tenant to pay the property tax. And so some of the municipalities in the Southland have flagged suspicious homes that are owned by these kinds of owners, out-of-town owners, where they're claiming homeowners exemptions that they should not be doing. And we're always eager to take those kinds of tips to increase enforcement. People should know out there in the land that we just put in place a new IT system that's gone live, that's modern. The contract was signed 5 years ago, but no one did the hard work to actually put it into place. Well, we put it into place and gone live. That allows lots of our systems to talk to each other, including services like TrueRoll. People should know that there is quite a technological tailwind that is going to make us better capturing at finding out and identifying cheaters.
We have a question, actually a board member. I'm not sure if I should use his name, so I will not, but he's a real estate professional. As a real estate professional in Cook County, specializing in commercial industrial properties in South and Southwest Chicago and suburban markets for 30 years, I've noticed the real estate taxes have escalated to an alarming level. What measures are being taken to reduce the reliance on real estate to pay for all government services?
I think the most important thing that's being done was something that was helped passed by Representative Will Davis several years ago, which is the evidence-based funding formula in our state. What that does is that formula provides a mechanism for more funding for school districts that are the most disadvantaged in terms of having the least amount of assessed value base and other measures of well-being. And that formula provides a good mechanism for more money to be coming into school districts in the Southland, which are the primary beneficiaries of this formula. And the key is making sure that our state can finance the additional amount of money, which is several $100 million per year, incrementally in the next couple of years, that it can do that. So that evidence-based funding formula is a key thing to move our school districts in a better direction so that the state is footing a little bit more of the bill for educating our children, because a dollar that comes in from the state for that is one less dollar that has to be levied on the hardworking owners of properties of brick and mortar in your communities. That's the most important thing. Our state you know, our state is should be providing a lot more. We're dead last in America on the state providing support for our school districts. About 25% of school district funding comes from the state. Most states it's closer to 50%. So there's quite a long way for the state to travel to get to a place like where Indiana is on this. But let's not forget the federal government. The federal government can do the same thing. And its mechanism is called Title I. For example, the city of Chicago, it has a $3 billion levy for the Chicago public schools. $300 million comes from Title I. And in President Biden's budget, it's proposed to double Title I to $600 million after this amount has stagnated for over a decade. So that can conceivably could really make a dent in the levy. Now, there are some restrictions on the federal government in terms of reducing levies if the federal government is providing more, but it can definitely slow down that growth that you're talking about. So federal Title I funding is at least as important, probably more important than what the state is doing in terms of controlling growth. And eventually, let's try to work so that the federal government aid can allow us to start reducing levies in places like the South Suburbs. I think that can really change the game on levies and property tax rates in the South Suburbs. No one has more riding on a federal policy like that than you. Nobody. There's no greater disparity in property taxes in America than in Cook County, and the South Suburbs gets the short end of that stick. So we should use this time, use the attention of policymakers in Washington to address this. And we should use our voices, talk about how unfair, what a deterrent it is to invest in communities that you care about, that you think are promising, if only the tax rate would be reasonable. And the federal government, you know, they spend $15 billion on Title I right now. Under President Biden's budget, it would double it to 30. Federal government eats $15 billion for breakfast every morning. That is just a fraction of what they used to bail out the airlines last year. Think about what a jolt of adrenaline it could be for housing values and for markets in the South Suburbs if the federal government would just move its little toe on this policy. So that's where I think the real big game is to be had right there. There are other things that we can do as citizens that can move things at the margin, but it's not that big. I mean, being good, making sure that your school districts know the value of $1 is helpful. That can slow the growth in levies, and you can target waste. Some consolidation will help, but guys, that is just going to be a rounding error compared to the other things that we can do on state policy on funding schools and federal policy for funding schools.
Great. This is a very interesting question from that same realtor. Obviously, in the South Suburbs, it's difficult to get businesses into town. And I'll read his question, but I find it interesting because it is the dichotomy between giving incentives to new businesses and rewarding existing businesses. As a real estate professional, Cook County the various programs that reduce real estate taxes for certain types of properties, such as those that qualify under Class 6B and Class 8, help reduce the burdens to business. What other measures can be taken to allow these properties suffering the disparity between next door to the lower tax favored Class 6 and Class 8 to make their taxes more equitable in relation? After all, these are the companies that have shouldered the tax burden for generations. I've seen this situation all over Cook County where one business owner, a longtime business that's operated for years, paying higher and higher taxes, paying twice the tax with basically the same property features as the next door new owner under Class 6B or 8. How is this fair? Even those I see benefit from the new businesses, it is really hurting your long-term businesses who now really want out of Cook County because of the unfair treatment and watching their next door neighbors get away with massive reductions while paying higher and higher taxes. So it's
such a great question.
It's a mix between luring businesses into Cook County and rewarding those that have been here for decades?
Such a great question. You know, I used to live in the north side of Chicago, and sometimes every now and then I do a little bit of handiwork around the house. And I used to go to a home improvement store called the Crafty Beaver, which was run by, it was a family home improvement business. And then, several years ago, the city, in its wisdom, decided to create a TIF, and they used TIF funds to attract a Home Depot. And so here is a multi-hundred-billion-dollar multinational corporation getting a subsidy from the state to compete against someone who was part of the backbone of a community doing a good job, that put their heart and soul into a business. I think that stinks. The way we can do this is it really requires good stewardship from our local leaders, and it also requires really good watchmanship by folks who build up communities to constantly back up the standard of fairness. TIFs are one way that subsidy, it's really, TIFs are one of the ways that you can have sub rosa corporate welfare that really hurts local authentic businesses. So all of you in your communities need to make sure that TIFs are not subsidizing things that other people could be that are already being provided in your community. A lot of times these incentives may not be entirely necessary. People should know that TIFs are kind of a backdoor tax increase on everyone else who's there when you create them. And sometimes there's really excessive claims made for the benefits to offset the clear disadvantage of higher rates on everyone else. These incentives are separate from TIFs. The incentives, they basically lower the base and raise the rate on every other property holder in the community through that incentive program. So they need to be used judiciously and need to make sure they're entirely necessary. Like they're, to attract a lot of investment, it may not be necessary to offer these incentives. There are a lot of suburbs where they felt like they had to do these incentives when they didn't really have to. I was talking to a municipality in Proviso where they had been talked into giving an incentive, and then lo and behold, the property ends up being bought later on by Amazon, and that original incentive holder had appealed the property down to close to nothing anyway. So really judicious leadership and decision making and watchful oversight by people in the community who will be shouldering the burdens for those kinds of incentives are really important.
Got another question from Christy De Laurentiis from South Suburban Mayors and Managers Association. I'm giving her two questions because I'm on the executive board for the South Suburban Mayors and Managers. So
that's fine.
The South Suburban Mayors and Managers has draft legislation. The Southland Reactivation Bill is in Springfield and seeks to get tax exempt properties back on the tax rolls through tax incentives so that we put more taxpayers contributing to the tax base, thus lowering the tax rates. How can we work together on this bill to get it passed so we have a new economic development tool which attracts new investments to local communities?
I support the idea of reactivating space that's been not been used, and I think let's look at what the devil is in the details on the actual incentives. I think a thing we have to remember is that sometimes economic circumstances can change, so we have to be careful that we don't overdo it. For example, I just want to name the phenomenon of Amazon and these super warehouses that are being built all over Cook County now. In some of the places they're building them, they asked for an incentive, they didn't get them, they're building them anyway. And they're going into places that they've not been before. So, and ditto, I think we're seeing great health in the apartment development business. Rents are at an all-time high in the suburbs. Occupancy rates are at an all-time high for apartments in the suburbs. So there is development coming that might not have been there before. And so, you know, in terms of using incentives, sometimes it can be a blunt tool, but I definitely support the idea of reactivating. It's really doing anything to build out the base in communities that have suffered from not having it. And I think looking at a lot of different ideas to that end is very important.
I know we're a little over time. I'll ask one more question, and then usually we try and keep this to an hour, but this is a very interesting and stimulating topic, and really a big topic here for the South Suburbs. So we really appreciate you going over a little bit here. This is actually from Trustee Hadnot also. Punishing commercial and industrial owners may look good politically, but will force those owners to abandon their property and leave the state. The burden then will shift back to residential property owners.
I agree. I don't think we should punish commercial and industrial property owners.
Okay.
I favor using market values for everyone.
Okay.
But which is what we're supposed to do under the law.
Yeah, I think the basis of that question, a lot of commercial and industrial properties in Cook County really got hit hard last time with the new reassessments. And I think that's what he's alluding to, is the fact that a lot of these businesses are in shock right now after receiving their tax bills. Well,
I think we should remember that if there was anyone who was underassessed before in the past, and now that's being corrected, where that we're actually reflecting market values. Think of who was making up for that before. Think of all the people, all the small businesses, all the homeowners who were making up for that undervaluation. And this is not a point of who's more important and who do we like more. The whole idea of using market values and assessments is to take that value decision out of the conversation, so that we're doing this based on market value, so that we're all paying our fair share of this burden. And then we can find policies that will make that burden smaller. But under the law, it's so crystal clear. It's based on market values. And think about how crazy it is in our office if in the assessment system, if we're not using market values for assessments. What in God's green earth are they using, right? What's the standard for what number? If you're not using a market value, where on earth is this number coming from? Who wins and who loses from that? And someone's going to be paying the short end of the stick if you're coming up with an imaginary number for an assessment instead of one that's real. And that's why we have a good law in our property tax code and a standard for fairness, and let's follow through on that. And then there are lots of other reforms that we can do, but it's not right to ask other people to shoulder a burden with a subsidized imaginary valuation on a non-transparent basis where there's no accountability for that. That's how our office got in trouble. I think that's sort of like the original sin.
Okay, I have a bunch more questions, but I know we've gone way over here. So Assessor Fritz Kaegi, thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it. I want to, Terry.
I just want to thank you very much. This has definitely been interesting, and obviously the amount of questions shows the interest in the topic. So thank you for the time that you spent with us and answering most of those questions. I have talked to Scott Smith and he said I could email him. So anybody in the audience that did not get your questions answered, we'll try to do that. I send a follow-up to all the people that participated. We did also record this, so it will be sent to your office, and it'll also be posted on our website, or excuse me, on our Facebook page, so people can view that as well. So, and then we might get more follow-up questions after that. So thanks very much, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks for attending.